On March 14, 1852, 7 women vanished from a plantation outside Montgomery, Alabama under circumstances that federal investigators would later describe as disturbing beyond conventional explanation. Dory, the men responsible, Elijah Thornhill, had lived as a hermit for 15 years before purchasing exactly 7 enslaved women at auction, marrying one of them 3 months later and watching the others disappear one by one over the following year. Local records show that authorities received 43 anonymous letters detailing the disappearances. Yet, no investigation was launched until a federal inspector arrived unannounced in September 1853. What he discovered in Thornhill's ledgers would reveal a pattern so methodical, so precisely calculated that it suggested years of planning. The truth behind those disappearances remained sealed in federal archives for 78 years. Before we continue with the story of Elijah Thornhill and the women who entered his property but never left, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell because stories like this one buried in forgotten documents and sealed testimonies are what we bring to light here. And tell me in the comments what state are you listening from right now. I want to know how far these dark histories reach. What the inspector found that September afternoon would challenge everything the community of Montgomery thought they knew about the quiet men who had lived among them for over a decade. The estate sat 3 miles west of Montgomery's main thoroughfare, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense groves of oak and pine. Locals called it Thornhill Estate, though Elijah Thornhill himself never used that name. To him, it was simply the property, a tract of 240 acres he had purchased in 1837 with money inherited from a textile business in Charleston. The main house was a modest 2-story structure, painted white, but grayed by 15 years of neglect, with 6 windows on the upper floor and 4 below. All of them shuttered even in daylight. Elijah Thornhill was 47 years old in 1852. A tall man with stooped shoulders and gray threading through dark hair he wore longer than fashion dictated. His face was weathered, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, and he possessed the distant gaze of someone who had stopped seeing the present moment years ago. He wore the same dark coat in all seasons, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, and boots that had been resoled so many times the leather had lost all shape. Those who remembered him from before 1837 described a different man entirely. Joshua Petton, who operated the general store on Commerce Street, recalled Elijah as gregarious and quick to laugh, a man who attended every social gathering and donated generously to the Methodist Church. He had a wife, Margaret, and 2 daughters, Petton told the federal inspector years later. Pretty little girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old. The family lived in a fine house on Court Street, right in the center of town. Then came the fire. The fire occurred on November 3, 1836, a date that appeared repeatedly in Elijah's journals, underlined so many times the paper had torn in places. The official report stated that the blaze started in the kitchen of the Thornhill residence around 2 o'clock in the morning, spreading rapidly through the wooden structure. By the time neighbors organized a bucket brigade, the entire building was engulfed. Margaret Thornhill died in her bed on the 2nd floor. The 2 daughters, Emily and Catherine, died in the nursery they shared. Elijah survived because he had been working late in his study, a small structure separate from the main house. But there was more to the story. Details that emerged slowly in the weeks following the tragedy. The fire had not been an accident. Investigators found evidence of forced entry through a rear window and traces of lamp oil in patterns inconsistent with normal household use. 3 families of enslaved people belonging to the Caldwell plantation located adjacent to the Thornhill property had escaped that same night. The timing was not coincidental. The fire was meant as a diversion, a way to draw attention while the escapees made their way north along routes that were just beginning to form into what would later be called the Underground Railroad. The Caldwell family never forgave the destruction the escape had caused to their neighbors. Neither did several other plantation families who saw the incident as evidence that enslaved people could not be trusted. That the abolitionist sentiment creeping south from the northern states was poisoning previously loyal workers. But more than anyone, Elijah Thornhill never forgave what had been taken from him. He disappeared from Montgomery society immediately after the funeral. He sold his Court Street property for a fraction of its value, purchased the isolated tract west of town, and withdrew completely from public life. For 15 years, he was seen only occasionally, always alone, purchasing supplies in town or conducting cotton business through intermediaries. He employed no one. His fields lay. The few visitors who made their way to his estate reported that he turned them away at the gate, speaking through the bars without opening them. What Elijah did during those 15 years of isolation remained unknown until the federal inspector examined his journals. The pages written in cramped handwriting that grew increasingly difficult to decipher as the years progressed revealed an obsession that had consumed every waking hour. He had spent those years researching, documenting, and planning. The journals contained names, dozens of them, organized into family trees that sprawled across multiple pages. Birth dates, marriage records, property transactions, business partnerships, all meticulously noted and cross-referenced. At the center of this web of information were 5 families: the Caldwells, the Harpers, the Suttons, the Bradfords, and the Reynoldses. All were prominent plantation owners in Montgomery County. All had connections, either through business or marriage, to the escape that had resulted in the fire that killed Elijah's family. And all of them had at various times owned or employed specific individuals whose names appeared again and again in Elijah's notes, circled and annotated with dates and locations. On February 28, 1852, 15 years and 4 months after the fire that destroyed his family, Elijah Thornhill emerged from his self-imposed isolation and attended a slave auction in Montgomery. It was the largest auction of the season, with over 60 people being sold to settle the estate of a bankrupt plantation owner from Selma. Elijah arrived early before most buyers had assembled and spent 3 hours examining the women available for purchase. According to the auctioneer's records preserved in the county clerk's office, Elijah purchased 7 women in a single transaction. The purchase price was unusually high, $3,000, more than twice what such a purchase should have cost. The women ranged in age from 19 to 34. Their names, as recorded in the bill of sale, were Hannah, Ruth, Leah, Dinah, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca. What the auctioneer did not record, but what would later become clear, was that Elijah had not chosen these women randomly. Each of them had a specific connection to the 5 families whose names filled his journals. Hannah had been born on the Caldwell plantation before being sold to the Selma estate. Ruth was the daughter of a woman who had worked in the Harper household. Leah had spent her childhood on the Sutton property. Dinah, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca each had similar histories. Connections to the families that Elijah had been studying for 15 years. The 7 women left the auction in a wagon Elijah had brought for the purpose, and they disappeared behind the gates of Thornhill Estate. For 3 months, nothing unusual was reported. Elijah was seen in town twice purchasing supplies in quantities that suggested he was finally putting his land to use. Neighbors noted smoke rising from the estate's chimneys regularly, the first time in years that the house appeared occupied. Then on May 19, 1852, Elijah Thornhill walked into the office of Judge Samuel Wickham and presented a marriage certificate. He had married Hannah, one of the 7 women, in a private ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher who traveled through the area monthly. The marriage was legal, shocking, but legal. Alabama law permitted such unions, though they were rare and socially condemned. Judge Wickham filed the certificate without comment, but by that evening, every household in Montgomery's elite circles was discussing the scandal. A plantation owner marrying an enslaved woman was not unprecedented, but it was deeply transgressive, especially for a man of Elijah's former social standing. The Methodist Church, which he had not attended in 15 years, sent a delegation to speak with him. He refused to see them. Former business associates crossed the street to avoid greeting him. Even those who might have sympathized with his long isolation now viewed him with suspicion and disgust. But Elijah showed no sign of caring about public opinion. He and Hannah were seen together twice in town over the summer, walking side by side, an arrangement that violated every social norm of the era. Hannah was described by witnesses as tall and quiet, with features that suggested intelligence and weariness in equal measure. She wore simple dresses, always dark-colored, and a bonnet that shaded most of her face. She never spoke in public, at least not where witnesses could report it. What happened to the other 6 women became the subject of intense speculation. They were never seen in town. No one reported hearing them or seeing them working in the fields. The estate remained as isolated as it had been during Elijah's years of solitude, with no signs of the activity that 7 additional residents should have produced. The first letter arrived at the marshal's office on July 2, 1852. It was written in careful script on cheap paper, and signed, and it stated simply, 6 women are being held against their will at the Thornhill estate. They are in danger. Someone must investigate. The marshal, an elderly man named Walter Gaines, read the letter and filed it away. Enslaved people were property, and if Elijah Thornhill chose to keep his property isolated, that was within his legal rights. 2 more letters arrived in August, 3 in September, and 5 in October. Each contained similar accusations, phrased differently, but making the same essential claim. The women were prisoners. They were being harmed. Someone needed to intervene. Marshall Gaines ignored all of them. Several prominent citizens, including members of the Caldwell and Harper families, also received anonymous letters. These were more specific, mentioning names and suggesting that the families themselves were somehow responsible for whatever was happening at the Thornhill estate. It was the letter sent to the federal office in Mobile that finally prompted action. That letter, dated November 14, 1852, contained not just accusations, but specific details about property law and interstate commerce that suggested the writer had legal knowledge. The letter argued that if Elijah Thornhill was holding people against their will, it constituted a violation of property rights belonging to the original owners, and since the women had been purchased at an estate sale involving bankruptcy and interstate transactions, federal jurisdiction might apply. The argument was thin, barely legal, but it was enough to catch the attention of Inspector Thomas Calloway, a federal agent who had been investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Calloway was known for his thoroughness and his willingness to pursue cases that local authorities ignored. He arrived in Montgomery on September 3, 1853, 17 months after Elijah had purchased the 7 women. What Calloway discovered in the following weeks would expose a truth far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. A plan so carefully executed that it had been operating in plain sight while the entire community looked away. Inspector Thomas Calloway was not what Montgomery's establishment expected. He was 31 years old, lean and clean-shaven in an era when most men wore beards, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had learned not to be intimidated by wealth or social position. He had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a printer, and had joined the Federal Marshal Service at 23, working primarily on cases involving customs fraud and illegal trade. His assignment to investigate slave trading irregularities had come about almost by accident, the result of a case involving fraudulent bills of sale that had crossed state lines. He checked into the Exchange Hotel on Commerce Street, a 3-story brick building that served as the center of Montgomery's business district. The proprietor, a thin-faced man named Arnold Hughes, eyed Calloway with barely concealed suspicion. Federal agents were not common visitors to Montgomery, and their presence usually meant trouble for someone. Calloway spent his first 3 days reviewing documents at the county clerk's office. He examined the bill of sale from the February auction, property records for the Thornhill estate, and tax records going back to 1837. He also requested access to court records related to the 1836 fire, a request that raised eyebrows, but was granted after Calloway invoked federal authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause. The clerk, a young man named David Patterson, who clearly enjoyed gossip, proved to be a valuable source of information. Mr. Thornhill was a different man before the fire, Patterson said, leaning across his desk conspiratorially. Owned one of the largest cotton factor businesses in the city, had contracts with plantations all over the state. But after his family died, he just stopped, sold everything, paid off all his debts, and disappeared into that estate. My father tried to visit him once around 1840 to discuss a business matter. Said Thornhill met him at the gate with a shotgun and told him to leave and never come back. Did anyone ever investigate the fire more thoroughly? Calloway asked. The records suggest it was arson, but I don't see any arrests. Patterson shook his head. Marshall Gaines investigated for about a week, then declared it unsolvable. The enslaved people who escaped that night were never found. They probably made it to free territory, maybe Ohio or Pennsylvania. The Caldwell family pushed for a bigger investigation, but it never happened. I think people just wanted to move on. Forget the whole ugly business. Calloway made notes in the small leather journal he carried. What about the women Thornhill purchased? Has anyone seen them? Only Hannah, the one he married, caused a huge scandal when he filed that marriage certificate. Judge Wickham was furious, but the law's the law. As for the others, Patterson lowered his voice further. There have been rumors. Some people claim to hear screaming at night from the estate, but it's far enough from any other houses that it could just be wind or animals. The letters started coming about a month after he brought them home. Anonymous, all of them. Marshall Gaines has a whole file. I'd like to see that file, Calloway said. Marshall Gaines was less cooperative than the clerk. He was 64 years old, had held his position for 30 years, and made it clear that he viewed Calloway's presence as an insult to his authority. "I read those letters," Gaines said, sitting behind his desk with his arms crossed. "Every single one. They're the work of abolitionists trying to stir up trouble. Probably written by the same person. Maybe someone who escaped North years ago and wants revenge." The handwriting varies significantly between letters, Calloway pointed out. "I counted at least 4 distinct hands." Gaines waved dismissively. "They're working together. Then the point is there's no evidence of any crime. Thornhill bought those women legally. What he does with his property is his business. Even if that property includes people being held against their will. They're slaves," Gaines said flatly. "Holding them against their will is the definition of slavery. If you want to change that, talk to Congress, not me." Calloway left the marshal's office with the letters which Gaines had reluctantly provided after Calloway threatened to return with a federal warrant. Back at the hotel, Calloway spread the letters across his bed and studied them carefully. Patterson had been right about the different handwriting. But there was more. The letters showed knowledge that suggested multiple sources, different perspectives on what was happening at the estate. Some focused on concerns for the women's safety. Others mentioned specific dates when something had occurred. One letter dated March 15, 1853 stated, "One of them is gone now. Disappeared like she never existed. No one asks questions because no one wants to know." The phrase "like she never existed" caught Calloway's attention. He retrieved the auction records and counted the names. 7 women purchased. Then he checked the property tax assessment for the Thornhill estate from 1853, which included a count of enslaved people on the property for tax purposes. The count was 6. One woman was officially missing from the records, and no one had noticed or cared. Calloway decided it was time to visit the Thornhill estate. The road to the property was worse than he had anticipated, rutted and overgrown, clearly not maintained for regular traffic. His rented horse picked its way carefully through the ruts as oak trees closed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the afternoon sun. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade, and the air smelled of damp earth and decomposing leaves. The gate appeared after a 20-minute ride. A simple barrier of iron bars set between 2 brick pillars. It was closed, but not locked. Calloway dismounted and pushed it open, the hinges squeaking in protest. The house stood another 100 red yards down the path exactly as described, white paint gone gray, shutters closed, and a general air of abandonment despite the smoke rising from one of the chimneys. As Calloway approached, the front door opened. Elijah Thornhill stepped out onto the porch, and Calloway's first impression was of a man who had aged far beyond his 48 years. Elijah was gaunt, his dark coat hanging loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. His hair was completely gray now, pulled back and tied at the nape of his neck. But his eyes were sharp, focused, and they tracked Calloway's every movement with an intensity that was almost predatory. "Inspector Calloway," Elijah said. His voice was rough, as if from disuse. "I was wondering when you would arrive." Calloway stopped at the base of the porch steps. "You were expecting me?" "Someone like you eventually." Elijah descended the steps slowly, keeping his hands visible. The letters would eventually reach someone who cared enough to investigate. "I'm surprised it took this long." "Did you write the letters yourself?" "No." Elijah stopped 3 feet from Calloway. "But I know who did. Several people, actually. Each with their own reasons for wanting attention brought to this place." "I'd like to see the women you purchased," Calloway said directly. "All 7 of them." Something flickered in Elijah's expression, gone too quickly to identify. "Of course, though I should correct you, there are only 6 women here, plus my wife Hannah. One of the original 7 died of fever last March. I reported it to the county clerk, but apparently the tax assessment wasn't updated." Calloway made a note. "I'll need to see the death certificate." "I don't have one." "She was buried on the property. Circuit preachers don't issue death certificates for slaves." "Inspector, you know that." It was true. Technically, though it was convenient for Elijah's story. "Then I'll need to see where she's buried." "Of course. But first, meet the others. They're working in the back of the house." Elijah led Calloway around the side of the building along a path of packed dirt that showed recent foot traffic. The backyard was larger than Calloway had expected, perhaps an acre of cleared land with several structures, a smokehouse, a root cellar with sloped doors, and a long, low building that might have been servants' quarters. 6 women were visible, 3 working in a vegetable garden near the tree-in, 2 carrying water buckets from a well, and 1 hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. They all looked up when Elijah and Calloway appeared, and Calloway saw the same expression on each face. Fear. Not the routine weariness that enslaved people showed around white strangers, but acute, immediate fear. One of the women near the well dropped her bucket, water sloshing across the ground. "These are Ruth, Leah, Dinah, Judith, and Naomi," Elijah said, gesturing vaguely toward the women. "And that's Rebecca at the laundry line. My wife Hannah is inside preparing dinner." "I'd like to speak with them," Calloway said. Individually, if possible. Elijah's expression hardened slightly. "On what grounds?" "Federal investigation into possible violations of property law and interstate commerce regulations. They're my property, inspector, legally purchased." "I've done nothing illegal." "Then you have nothing to worry about." Calloway kept his voice level. "I just need to verify that the women are here of their own will, or rather that they're being held according to legal standards." The absurdity of the phrase "their own will" hung in the air between them. Both men knew that enslaved people had no legal will, but the fiction had to be maintained. Elijah considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You may speak with them, but I'll be present for the conversations." "That's not acceptable." "Then you'll need a warrant, Inspector. And given that I've committed no crime, I doubt you'll get one from Judge Wickham." He was probably right. Calloway shifted his approach. "Let me speak with your wife, then. Surely you have no objection to me speaking with Hannah." Elijah's jaw tightened, the first real sign of emotion Calloway had seen. "Hannah is my wife. She has nothing to do with your investigation. She's one of the 7 women purchased at auction. Therefore, she's directly relevant." For several seconds, Elijah didn't move. The women in the yard had gone completely still, watching the confrontation with expressions that suggested they understood exactly what was at stake. Then Elijah turned abruptly and walked toward the house. "Come inside, Inspector. You can speak with Hannah in the parlor." 5 minutes, no more. Calloway followed him into the house. The interior was dim, lit only by a few windows where shutters had been partially opened. The furniture was sparse but well made. A settee, 2 chairs, a small table. Everything was meticulously clean but worn as if it had been in use for decades without replacement. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, a bitter herbal scent Calloway couldn't identify. Hannah emerged from what must have been the kitchen. She was tall, as the witnesses had described, with dark skin and features that suggested mixed African and indigenous heritage. She wore a simple gray dress with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back beneath a blue headscarf. Her eyes met Calloway's for just a moment before dropping to the floor, a gesture of submission that seemed practiced. "Hannah, this is Inspector Calloway," Elijah said. "He wants to ask you some questions. You're to answer truthfully." "Yes, sir," Hannah said quietly. Elijah positioned himself near the doorway, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to maintain the pretense of privacy. Calloway sat in one of the chairs and gestured for Hannah to take the settee. She sat on the edge of the cushion, hands folded in her lap, posture rigid. "How long have you been here, Hannah?" Calloway asked gently. "Since February of last year, sir." "A year and 7 months. And you married Mr. Thornhill 3 months after arriving?" "Yes, sir." "Was that your choice?" Hannah's eyes flickered toward Elijah, then back to her hands. "He asked me to marry him, sir." I said, "Yes." "Were you afraid of what might happen if you refused?" Elijah's voice cut across the room. "Inspector, you're leading the witness." Calloway ignored him. "Hannah, are you here against your will? Do you want to leave?" For the first time, Hannah looked directly at him, and what Calloway saw in her eyes was not fear, but something far more complex. Exhaustion, resignation, and something that might have been bitter amusement. "I'm a slave, Inspector. I go where I'm told and do what I'm told. My will doesn't enter into it. But you're also Mr. Thornhill's wife. That gives you certain legal protections, does it? Hannah's voice remained quiet but carried an edge now. I wasn't aware that marriage changed the color of my skin or the law of this state. Calloway leaned forward. If something illegal is happening here, I can help. But I need you to tell me the truth. Hannah was silent for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, nothing illegal is happening here, Inspector. Everything Mr. Thornhill has done is within the law. You can verify that yourself. The phrasing was odd. Deliberate. Calloway heard what she wasn't saying as clearly as what she was. Legal and moral were not the same thing. What happened to Rebecca? Calloway asked suddenly. The seventh woman. Hannah's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened in her lap. She took sick last March. Fever. She died within a week. We buried her in the woods. I'd like to see the grave. Of course, Elijah said from the doorway, as I offered earlier, but first, Inspector, your 5 minutes are up. Calloway stood reluctantly. He'd learned something, though he wasn't sure what yet. Hannah's careful wording, the fear on the other women's faces, the single missing woman who had conveniently died of fever. All of it suggested something was deeply wrong at the Thornhill estate. But wrong and illegal were different standards, especially in Alabama in 1853. Elijah led him back outside and across the yard toward the treein. The 6 women had returned to their work, but Calloway could feel them watching as he passed. None of them spoke or made eye contact. The grave was 100 yards into the woods, marked by a simple wooden cross with no name. The earth was settled, suggesting the burial had occurred months ago, as claimed. Calloway examined the site carefully but found nothing suspicious. If Rebecca had died of fever and been buried here, this is exactly what it would look like. Satisfied? Elijah asked. Not remotely, Calloway said. But I'll need more evidence before I can proceed. I'll be staying in Montgomery for the foreseeable future. I may return with additional questions. You're welcome anytime, Inspector. As you can see, I have nothing to hide. But as Calloway rode back toward Montgomery, with the afternoon sun slanting through the trees and the sounds of the estate fading behind him, he knew that Elijah Thornhill was hiding something. The question was what, and whether it was illegal enough to justify federal intervention. The answer would come from an unexpected source. One of the women from the estate speaking through words she had written months ago, waiting for someone to find them. Inspector Calloway spent the next week conducting interviews throughout Montgomery. He spoke with the auctioneer who had sold the 7 women to Elijah, with merchants who had supplied the estate over the past year, with neighbors whose property bordered Thornhill land, and with members of the 5 families whose names appeared repeatedly in connection to the 1836 fire. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Porter Williams, remembered the transaction clearly. Never seen anything like it. Williams said, sitting in his office above a tobacco shop. Man comes in, looks at every woman we have available, then picks 7 specific ones, and pays premium price without negotiating. Usually buyers want to haggle, especially for that many at once. But Mr. Thornhill just counted out the money and asked for immediate transfer of ownership. Had a wagon waiting outside. Did he explain why he wanted those particular women? William shook his head. Didn't ask. Frankly, didn't care. A sale's a sale. Though I did notice he spent a long time talking to each of them before making his decision. Asked them questions about their history, where they'd worked, who their families were. Most buyers don't bother with that kind of detail. Did the women seem afraid of him? No more than they were afraid of everyone else. They were being sold. Inspector. Fear was the primary emotion in that room, regardless of who was buying. The merchants provided similar stories. Elijah had been a regular customer since the previous February, purchasing supplies in quantities that suggested he was finally putting his land to use. Flour, sugar, salt, lamp oil, fabric, tools, seeds. Nothing unusual except the quantities, which were larger than needed for 8 people, but not suspiciously so. The neighbors were less helpful. The nearest property was 3/4 of a mile away, owned by a farmer named Douglas Pritchard, who grew tobacco and raised hogs. Don't see much from over there, Pritchard said. The trees are too thick, and I mind my own business. Heard he married one of his slaves, which is his affair, not mine. Haven't heard any screaming or seen anything suspicious if that's what you're asking. You're sure? No unusual sounds at night? Pritchard hesitated. Well, there was one night maybe back in April or May. Heard something that might have been a woman crying, but it was far off. Could have been an animal. Didn't last long. Mentioned it to my wife and she said it was probably just an owl. We let it go. The conversations with the 5 families proved most interesting, particularly because of what they refused to say. Richard Caldwell, patriarch of the Caldwell plantation, received Calloway in a drawing room that reeked of cigar smoke and old money. He was 71 years old, corpulent and red-faced, with hands that trembled slightly as he lifted a glass of whiskey to his lips. Thornhill's a madman, Caldwell said bluntly. Always was, even before the fire. Too intense, too focused on things that didn't matter. When his family died, it broke whatever was left of his mind. Marrying a slave woman. That's just the latest evidence of his insanity. Did you receive any of the anonymous letters about conditions at his estate? Caldwell's expression darkened. I received several. All of them nonsense, trying to implicate me in whatever delusions Thornhill is living under. I had nothing to do with that fire. Inspector, my property was damaged by it, too. 3 barns burned when the wind shifted. And yes, some of my people escaped that night, but they were recaptured within a month. This has nothing to do with me. The letters suggest otherwise. The letters were written by abolitionists or by Thornhill himself to create sympathy. Either way, they're irrelevant. If you want to investigate a crime, investigate Thornhill's theft of property. Those women he purchased came from an estate that was settled fraudulently. There are liens against that sale that were never resolved. It was a deflection, obvious clumsy, but it revealed something. Caldwell was worried. Calloway filed that information away and moved on to the next family. The pattern repeated with the Harpers, Suttons, Bradfords, and Reynoldses. All had received anonymous letters. All dismissed them as malicious lies. All insisted they had no connection to Elijah Thornhill beyond the tangential relationship created by the 1836 fire. And all of them, without exception, seemed anxious to end the conversations as quickly as possible. On the 8th day of his investigation, Calloway received a message at his hotel. It was delivered by a young black boy, perhaps 10 years old, who handed him a folded piece of paper and ran away before Calloway could ask any questions. The note was written in careful, educated handwriting. If you want to understand what is happening at the Thornhill estate, examine the property records for the 5 families. Pay special attention to transfers that occurred in late 1836 and early 1837. Truth is hidden in plain sight. Calloway returned to the clerk's office and requested all property records for the 5 families covering the period from November 1836 through June 1837. David Patterson brought out 3 thick ledgers and spread them across a reading table. This will take a while, Passanson said. These families own substantial holdings. What exactly are you looking for? I'll know when I see it, Calloway said. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening until Patterson had to light lamps to continue. The records were dense and difficult to parse, filled with legal language and abbreviations that required Patterson's help to understand. But slowly, a pattern emerged. In the 6 months following the fire, all 5 families had conducted significant property transfers. The Caldwells had sold 3 enslaved people to a plantation in Georgia. The Harpers had sold 5 to a buyer in Louisiana. The Suttons, Bradfords, and Reynoldses had conducted similar transactions, each selling or transferring small numbers of enslaved people to distant locations. Individually, the transactions were unremarkable. Plantation families bought and sold slaves regularly, often for financial reasons or to break up families as punishment. But taken together, the pattern suggested something else. The 5 families had been systematically removing specific people from their properties and sending them where they couldn't be questioned about what had happened the night of the fire. Calloway made a list of names from the transfer documents, then cross-referenced them with the names in Elijah's journals, which he had retrieved from the estate during his first visit. The overlap was striking. Nearly every person the 5 families had sold or transferred in early 1837 appeared somewhere in Elijah's meticulous research notes. But there was more. Among the names were family relationships that connected back to the 7 women Elijah had purchased in 1852. Hannah's mother had been owned by the Caldwells and transferred to Georgia in January 1837. Ruth's grandmother had worked for the Harpers and been sold to Louisiana. Leah, Dinah, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca all had similar connections, familiar links to people who had been present on or near the properties the night of the fire. And then quickly removed. Elijah hadn't chosen these 7 women randomly. He had selected them because of who their families were, because of what those families might have known about the events of November 3, 1836. The next morning, Calloway returned to the Thornhill estate unannounced. Elijah was working in the vegetable garden, tying up tomato plants with strips of cloth. He looked up as Calloway approached, but didn't stop working. "Back so soon?" "Inspector, I thought our business was concluded." "I'd like to see your journals," Calloway said. "The ones you kept during your 15 years of isolation." Elijah straightened slowly, wiping soil from his hands. "My journals are private property, Inspector. You have no legal right to them." "I'm not asking for a right. I'm asking for cooperation. Unless you'd prefer I return with federal marshals and a warrant that allows me to search every inch of this property." The threat hung in the air between them. Elijah studied Calloway's face for a long moment, then nodded toward the house. "Come inside." The study was on the second floor, a small room with a single window overlooking the backyard. Shelves lined 3 walls filled with ledgers, journals, and loose papers organized in stacks tied with string. A desk sat beneath the window, its surface covered with maps of Montgomery County and the surrounding region. Elijah pulled a wooden chair away from the desk and gestured for Calloway to sit. "These are 15 years of my life," Elijah said quietly, running his hand along one shelf. "Every day documented, every detail recorded. What exactly do you hope to find?" "The truth about why you bought those 7 women." Elijah selected 3 journals from the shelf and placed them on the desk. "Then read, Inspector. But understand that what you find won't change anything. I've broken no laws." Calloway opened the first journal and began to read. The entry started in late November 1836, just days after the fire. The handwriting was shaky at first, the words of a man in acute grief. "Margaret is gone. Emily is gone. Catherine is gone. The house is ash. I have nothing left but questions and the need for answers." The entries that followed chronicled Elijah's descent into obsession. He had hired investigators, interviewed witnesses, and spent weeks reconstructing the events of that night. The escape from the Caldwell plantation had been planned for months, coordinated by an unknown organizer, who had connections throughout the network of plantations in Montgomery County. The fire at Elijah's house had not been an accident or collateral damage. It had been deliberate, set by someone who knew the layout of his property, and understood that the fire would serve as a distraction while the escapees made their way north. But who had set it? The investigators had found no clear evidence, and the Caldwell family had pressured authorities to close the case quickly. Too many questions about the escape might reveal uncomfortable truths about security on their own plantation, about the possibility that some of their trusted workers had been planning rebellion. Elijah's journal showed that he had continued investigating long after official channels had given up. He had spent months, then years, tracking down anyone who might have information. He had interviewed field workers, house servants, overseers, and free black residents of Montgomery who might have heard rumors. Slowly, painfully, he had assembled a picture of what had happened. The escape had been organized by a network that included both enslaved people and free black residents of the area. The fire at Elijah's house had been set by 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, all of whom had worked on properties belonging to the 5 families. The woman had worked in the Caldwell house. 1 man had been employed by the Harpers. The other had belonged to the Reynolds family. All 3 had escaped that night and were never recaptured, but Elijah had learned their names: Samuel, Marcus, and Dinah. And more importantly, he had learned the names of their family members who remained in the area. People who might have known about the plan, who might have helped, who carried the guilt of what had been done to his family. Calloway looked up from the journal. "You've been tracking their descendants, their children, their siblings, their cousins," Elijah confirmed. "Anyone who might carry the knowledge of what happened, anyone who might have heard confessions or seen evidence." And the 7 women you purchased are all related to the people who escaped that night. Not all of them, but most. Elijah's voice was flat, emotionless. Hannah is the niece of Dinah, the woman who set the fire. Ruth's father was Samuel's brother. Leah's mother was Marcus's cousin. The connections are there, Inspector, documented in records across 3 counties. I spent 15 years finding them. So this is revenge, Calloway said. You bought these women to punish them for what their relatives did. Elijah's expression didn't change. I bought them to learn the truth. Their families carry stories, memories passed down through generations. I needed to hear those stories. And did they tell you what you wanted to know? For the first time, something like pain crossed Elijah's face. Some of them. Hannah knew more than the others. Her Aunt Dinah had told her family about that night before she escaped north. The fire was supposed to be a distraction, nothing more. They didn't know anyone was home. My study was separate from the main house, and they assumed I was there, that I would be safe. They never intended to kill my wife and daughters. The words hung in the small room, and Calloway felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air, but they died anyway. They died anyway, Elijah repeated softly. And Dinah, Samuel, and Marcus escaped to freedom while I buried my family. The 5 families helped cover it up, helped make sure no one asked too many questions because they didn't want anyone examining how enslaved people on their properties had organized such an effective escape. They sold off anyone who might talk, scattered the witnesses across the South, and closed ranks. Calloway closed the journal. So, you've spent 15 years planning revenge. What did you do to these women, Elijah? What happened to Rebecca? Elijah turned away, looking out the window toward the backyard where the 6 women continued their work. I did nothing illegal, Inspector. Everything I've done is within the law of this state and this nation. That's the terrible truth you'll have to accept. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you'll get from me. Elijah's voice hardened. If you want to know more, ask the women themselves. Ask Hannah. She'll tell you the truth. All of it. If you ask the right questions, Calloway stood, frustration mounting. I'm asking you right now. What happened to Rebecca? Elijah met his gaze directly. She died of fever as I told you. She's buried in the woods as you saw. Everything else is speculation and suspicion. Inspector, you have no evidence of any crime because no crime has been committed. Then why the anonymous letters? Why would someone go to such lengths to draw attention here if nothing illegal is happening? For the first time, Elijah smiled, and it was one of the most unsettling expressions Calloway had ever seen. Because sometimes, Inspector, the law and justice are not the same thing. And sometimes the people who understand that best are the ones who suffer most under the law's protection. Calloway left the estate that afternoon with copies of several journal pages that Elijah had allowed him to take, but no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The journals revealed obsession, grief, and a 15-year plan to gather information about the people responsible for his family's death, but they revealed no crimes. Back at his hotel, Calloway spread the documents across his bed and tried to make sense of what he had learned. Elijah had purchased 7 women connected to the families of those who had escaped in 1836. He had married one of them. One had died under mysterious circumstances. The others remained on his property, clearly afraid, but not physically harmed in ways that left evidence. What was Elijah's real plan? Was it simply to interrogate these women to learn the truth about that night? Or was something darker happening? Something that left no legal trace? The answer came 3 days later from an unexpected source. The woman appeared at Calloway's hotel room door just after dawn on September 19, 1853. She was small and elderly, perhaps 70 years old, with gray hair pulled back beneath a faded yellow headscarf. Her hand shook as she clutched a folded piece of paper against her chest. Inspector Calloway. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, how can I help you? I have something you need to see. Something Hannah gave me to give to you, but only if she couldn't come herself. Calloway opened the door wider. Come in, please. The woman entered hesitantly, glancing back down the hallway as if afraid of being followed. She sat on the edge of the only chair in the room, her posture rigid with tension. My name is Abigail Tate. I'm a free woman, work as a seamstress here in town. Hannah came to me 6 months ago, asked me to hold this paper safe. She said if anything happened to her or if a federal inspector came asking questions, I was to give it to him. She handed the paper to Calloway. It was worn soft from much folding and unfolding, the edges frayed. The handwriting was careful and surprisingly educated, written in ink that had faded to brown. My name is Hannah. I am writing this in March of 1853, 1 year after Master Thornhill purchased me and 6 other women at auction. I am writing this because I believe I may not survive what is happening here and someone needs to know the truth. Master Thornhill is not a cruel man in the way most people understand cruelty. He does not beat us or starve us. The house is comfortable. We have adequate food and clothing, but we are prisoners in ways more terrible than chains. He married me 3 months after we arrived because he needed a wife to make his plan appear normal to the community. But the marriage is a performance. He has never touched me as a husband touches a wife. He has never raised his voice to me. But every day he asks questions. Questions about my Aunt Dina. About what she told my mother before she escaped north. Questions about the night of the fire. About who knew what and when. Questions about the other families. About connections between workers on different plantations. About how information traveled through the community. At first, I tried not to answer. Then I realized that resistance was pointless. He already knew most of what he asked. He had spent 15 years researching, documenting, building a picture of that night and the network of people who made the escape possible. He only wanted confirmation, details, the human stories behind the facts he had collected. So I told him everything I knew about my Aunt Dina. About how she had been part of the planning for months. About how the fire was meant only as a distraction. About how she never forgave herself for the deaths of Master Thornhill's wife and daughters. I told him about the 5 families and how they had covered up the escape to protect their own reputations. I told him every story my mother had told me, every rumor I had heard, every connection I knew. And when I was finished, he thanked me. Then he brought Ruth to his study and began asking her the same questions. We are not here to be punished. I realized we are here to be documented. Master Thornhill is creating a record of what happened, told through the voices of those whose families were involved. He treats us well because he needs us healthy and clear-minded. He married me because he needed someone he could trust to help him with his work. But Rebecca refused to cooperate. She would not speak to him, would not answer questions. She said that her grandmother had fled north and she would not betray her memory by helping the men whose family had been killed in that escape. Master Thornhill did not force her. He did not punish her. He simply stopped feeding her. It happened slowly. First her portions became smaller. Then she was given only bread and water. Then for 3 days, nothing at all. We tried to share our food with her, but Master Thornhill watched us constantly. Any food we gave her was taken from our own portions. The next day, Rebecca became weaker. She begged him to let her speak, to tell him what he wanted to know. But by then, she was too weak to remember clearly. The fever came soon after, brought on by starvation and despair. She died on March 11, 1853. We buried her in the woods. Master Thornhill conducted a brief service, reading from the Bible as if she had died naturally. And in the eyes of the law, perhaps she had. He never struck her. He never denied her water. He simply withdrew food, which is within his legal right as her owner. This is what Master Thornhill does. He operates within the law while destroying us from the inside. He uses our own fear, our own hunger, our own desperation as weapons, and there is no crime in any of it. I am writing this because I believe others may follow Rebecca's path. Leah has been asking questions, wondering why we must tell him everything, whether we might be feeding his obsession rather than satisfying it. Dinina has been silent for 3 weeks now, refusing to speak. I fear for them both. If you are reading this, Inspector Calloway or whoever you are, know that Master Thornhill has committed no crime under the laws of Alabama or the United States. But he has created a hell that operates within those laws, a prison built from legal rights and property ownership. We are not beaten or worked to death. We are simply erased one by one through methods that leave no evidence. I do not know if there is anything you can do to stop him, but at least now someone will know the truth. The letter was signed with Hannah's name and dated March 17, 1853, 6 months before Calloway had arrived in Montgomery. He looked up at Abigail Tate, who was watching him with eyes that held both hope and despair. "Why didn't Hannah come to me herself?" "She can't leave the property," Abigail said. "Master Thornhill doesn't lock the doors or chain anyone, but he watches constantly, and she's afraid. If he knew she had written this, if he knew she had given it to me, he would withdraw her food as well." Calloway finished grimly. Abigail nodded. She said, "You seemed like a man who wanted to help, but she also said you were bound by the law, just like Master Thornhill." She didn't know if this letter would make any difference, but she had to try. Calloway read the letter again, his mind racing through legal precedents and federal statutes. Starvation as a method of control was not explicitly illegal when applied to enslaved people. Property owners had the right to discipline their property as they saw fit, within extremely broad boundaries. As long as Elijah didn't kill anyone outright, as long as he could claim that any deaths were natural consequences of illness or refusal to eat rather than deliberate starvation, he was operating within legal bounds. But there had to be something, some angle of approach that would allow federal intervention. "Abigail, I need you to do something for me," Calloway said carefully. "I need you to get a message to Hannah. Tell her I'm going to return to the estate this afternoon and I need to speak with her privately. Tell her to find a way to be alone away from Elijah, even if only for a few minutes." "How will she manage that?" "I don't know, but if she's as intelligent as this letter suggests, she'll find a way." Abigail left through the back entrance of the hotel, and Calloway spent the next 3 hours preparing his approach. He needed evidence that would hold up in federal court, something that demonstrated clear violation of property rights or interstate commerce laws. Anna's letter was powerful testimony, but it wasn't enough on its own. He needed physical evidence, witnesses, something concrete. He arrived at the Thornhill estate at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Elijah was working in the smokehouse, preparing meat for winter storage. He looked up as Calloway approached, his expression neutral. "Back again, Inspector. I'm beginning to think you enjoy our conversations. I need to speak with Hannah again, alone this time, without you present." Elijah set down the knife he had been using. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that as your legal wife, she has rights that transcend property law. I'm investigating allegations of abuse, and I need to interview her without the presence of the accused." It was a thin argument, barely supported by law. But Elijah considered it for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well. Hannah is in the house preparing dinner. You may speak with her in the parlor. I'll remain outside." Calloway found Hannah exactly where Elijah had said, working in the kitchen over a pot of stew. She looked up as he entered and their eyes met. In that brief moment of contact, Calloway saw recognition. She knew Abigail had delivered the letter. "Mrs. Thornhill," Calloway said formally, "I need to speak with you privately. Your husband has given permission for us to talk in the parlor." Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and followed him into the front room. Calloway positioned himself so he could see the windows, ensuring that Elijah couldn't approach without being noticed. Hannah sat on the settee, her posture more relaxed than during their first conversation. "You received my letter," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I did. Abigail Tate brought it to me this morning." "Then you know what's happening here." "I know what you've told me. But I need more, Hannah. I need evidence that will hold up in court. The letter describes starvation, but unless I can prove that Elijah deliberately withheld food with the intent to harm or kill Rebecca, it won't be enough to justify federal intervention." Hannah's hands tightened in her lap. "What kind of evidence?" "Witnesses, physical proof, anything that demonstrates a pattern of abuse beyond what property law allows. There are 6 of us who can testify." "Isn't that enough?" "Not when you're all considered property under state law. Your testimony has limited legal weight. I need something more." Hannah was silent for a moment, staring at her hands. Then she said very quietly, "There's another letter. Rebecca wrote it before she died. While she still had the strength, she hid it in the root cellar under a loose board near the back wall. I know where it is, but I can't retrieve it without Master Thornhill seeing." Calloway's pulse quickened. "What does it say?" "I don't know. She wrote it in secret over several days. She said it was her testimony, her proof of what he was doing. She said, if anyone ever came to investigate, they should find it and read it. Can you draw me a map of where exactly it's hidden? Anna glanced toward the window, checking for Elijah's location. He was still visible near the smokehouse, his back turned to the house. She took a scrap of paper from her apron pocket and a stub of pencil and quickly sketched the interior of the root cellar. Here, she said, marking a spot near the back, 3 boards from the corner, loose on one end. Lift it carefully. Calloway took the paper. I'll need to search the property officially with Elijah's permission or with a warrant. He'll never give permission. And by the time you return with a warrant, the letter will be gone. He checks the cellar every few days. Then I'll have to find another way. Calloway stood. Hannah, what you've done writing that letter, getting it to me, it's incredibly brave. But you need to understand that even with Rebecca's testimony, I may not be able to remove you from this property. The law protects Elijah's rights as your owner and your husband. I know. Hannah's voice was steady, resigned. But at least someone will know the truth. At least what he's doing won't remain hidden forever. Calloway left the parlor and sought out Elijah, who was washing his hands at the pump in the yard. I need to inspect your property thoroughly. Calloway said the buildings, the cellar, everything. Elijah dried his hands slowly on a rag. Do you have a warrant, Inspector? I can get one. Then get one. Until you have legal authority to search my property, I must decline. As I've told you repeatedly, I've broken no laws. If you believe otherwise, prove it through proper legal channels. Calloway rode back to Montgomery, frustrated but not defeated. He had Hannah's letter, her testimony about Rebecca's hidden message and a growing picture of Elijah's methods. It might not be enough for a conviction, but it could be enough to pressure a judge into issuing a search warrant. He spent that evening drafting a formal request, citing Hannah's letter as evidence of suspicious circumstances surrounding Rebecca's death, arguing that a thorough search of the property was necessary to rule out foul play. He presented it to Judge Wickham the next morning. Wickham read the request slowly, his expression unreadable. He was 62 years old, a veteran of Alabama's legal system, and known for his strict interpretation of property rights. Inspector Calloway, he said finally, what you're describing in this letter, if true, is morally reprehensible, but I'm not sure it violates any specific statute. A woman died under suspicious circumstances, Your Honor. Federal law requires investigation when interstate property rights may be involved. The woman was purchased legally at a state auction. Her death occurred on private property. Unless you can demonstrate that her death resulted from actions that violate specific federal statutes, I don't see grounds for a warrant. What about the testimony of the other women? They witnessed what happened. They're slaves, Inspector. Their testimony has no legal standing in Alabama courts. You know that as well as I do. Calloway leaned forward. Then change the law, Your Honor. Or at least allow me to search for evidence that might support federal charges under interstate commerce statutes. Wickham was silent for a long moment. Then he signed the warrant. You have 24 hours, Inspector, search the property thoroughly, but understand that unless you find clear evidence of violations that fall under federal jurisdiction, this investigation is over. I won't authorize further intrusion on Mr. Thornhill's property rights based solely on moral objections to how he exercises those rights. Calloway took the warrant and returned to the Thornhill estate that same afternoon, accompanied by 2 federal marshals from Mobile, who had arrived that morning in response to his earlier request for support. Elijah met them at the gate, his expression unreadable. I have a warrant, Calloway said, handing over the document. Elijah read it carefully, then opened the gate. Search as you will, Inspector. You'll find nothing illegal. The search took 3 hours. Calloway and the marshals examined every building, every room, every corner of the property. They found the grave in the woods exactly as described. They searched the house, the smokehouse, the servants' quarters, and finally they searched the root cellar. The space was dark and cool, lit only by the lamp. Calloway carried shelves lined the walls stocked with preserved foods, root vegetables, and supplies. Calloway moved to the back corner, counting boards according to Hannah's map, 3 from the corner, loose on one end. He knelt and lifted carefully. The board came up easily, revealing a small hollow beneath. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and moisture. The ink faded but still legible. Calloway unfolded it carefully and began to read by lamplight. The handwriting was shaky, weak, but the words were clear. My name is Rebecca. I am dying because I would not tell Master Thornhill what he wanted to know about my grandmother, who escaped north in 1836. He has not beaten me or worked me to death. He has simply stopped feeding me a little more each day until I am too weak to stand. This is how he punishes disobedience. This is how he controls us. By the time anyone reads this, I will be dead. But I want someone to know that I chose death rather than betray my grandmother's memory. I want someone to know what Master Thornhill is doing, even though it is within his legal rights. I want someone to know that we are human beings, not property, and we deserve to be remembered. The letter was dated March 9, 1853, 2 days before Rebecca's death. According to Hannah's letter, Calloway climbed out of the cellar with the document in his hand, his mind racing through legal precedents. This was evidence of deliberate starvation, written testimony from the victim herself. But was it enough? Rebecca had acknowledged in her own words that Elijah operated within his legal rights. She had admitted to refusing to cooperate with his demands. In the eyes of Alabama law, Elijah had been exercising his property rights, disciplining a disobedient slave through withholding of food. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was an angle. Calloway found Elijah standing near the house watching the search with an expression of patient tolerance. I found Rebecca's letter. Calloway said her testimony about how you starved her to death. I didn't starve her, Elijah said calmly. I reduced her rations as punishment for disobedience. She died of fever, weakened by her own refusal to eat what little she was given. The law allows owners to discipline their property as they see fit. The law also has boundaries. Even in Alabama, deliberate starvation that results in death could be considered destruction of property belonging to the estate that sold her to you. That crosses into federal jurisdiction under interstate commerce law. It was a stretch barely supported by precedent. But Elijah's expression tightened slightly. You're reaching, Inspector. Maybe. But I have 2 letters now. Written testimony from women who were present and probable cause to arrest you pending further investigation. You can come voluntarily or I can have the marshals take you by force. For a long moment, Elijah didn't move. Then he nodded slowly. I'll come voluntarily. But this will never go to trial, Inspector. You know that as well as I do. No judge in Alabama will convict a white man for how he disciplines his property. We'll see, Calloway said. But as the marshals led Elijah away, he knew the man was probably right. The trial of Elijah Thornhill began on November 2, 1853, exactly 17 years and 1 day after the fire that had killed his family. It was held in federal court in Mobile, presided over by Judge Harrison Carmichael, one of the few federal judges in the region with a reputation for occasionally ruling against property owners in cases involving clear abuse. The courtroom was packed with spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. A white man on trial for starving his own slave to death, accused based on letters written by enslaved women. The prosecution, led by Calloway and a federal attorney named Robert Ashton, built their case around Rebecca's letter and Hannah's testimony about the systematic way Elijah had interrogated and controlled the 7 women. The defense, led by a prominent Montgomery attorney named Charles Rutherford, argued that Elijah had acted within his legal rights as a property owner, that Rebecca had died of fever rather than starvation, and that her own letter admitted she had been disobedient and refused to eat the food she was given. On the 3rd day of the trial, Hannah was called to testify. It was highly unusual for an enslaved person to testify in any court, let alone federal court. But Judge Carmichael had ruled that as Elijah's legal wife, Hannah had limited standing to provide testimony about events in her household. She took the stand wearing a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back beneath a white headscarf. Her voice was steady as she answered Ashton's questions about life on the Thornhill estate, about the questions Elijah asked, about the fear that permeated every day, about watching Rebecca grow weaker until she died. Then came the defense's cross-examination. Rutherford stood and approached Hannah with an expression of practiced sympathy. Mrs. Thornhill. You've described your husband as controlling and obsessive. Yet he married you, gave you his name, made you the mistress of his household. Why would he do that if his only goal was to punish you? Hannah met his gaze steadily. He married me because he needed someone who could help him with his work, someone he could trust to organize the others to ensure they cooperated with his questions. He chose me because I was willing to tell him what he wanted to know. So you cooperated willingly. I cooperated to survive. And did your husband ever strike you, deny you food, treat you cruelly in any physical way? No. Did he provide adequate shelter, clothing, and food for you and the other women? Yes. Then what precisely was cruel about his treatment? What law did he violate? Anna was silent for a moment. Then she said very carefully, he violated no law. That is the horror of it. Everything he did, every method he used to control us, to break Rebecca's spirit, to make us prisoners in that house, all of it was legal. The law protects his right to own us, to discipline us, to do whatever he wishes with us, as long as he doesn't destroy us outright. And even when he does destroy us, as he destroyed Rebecca, he can claim it was an accident, a consequence of her own disobedience. Rutherford's expression hardened. So you admit that Rebecca's death was a result of her own refusal to cooperate? I admit that she died because my husband stopped feeding her. Whether you call that her fault or his depends on whether you believe human beings have the right to resist their owners. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. And Judge Carmichael gave for silence. Rutherford tried several more questions, attempting to undermine Hannah's credibility or force her to admit that Elijah had acted within his rights, but she held firm. Every answer acknowledged the legality of his actions while making clear the moral horror underneath. When Hannah stepped down, Calloway felt a flicker of hope. Her testimony had been powerful, painting a picture of systematic abuse that operated within legal boundaries. But would it be enough? The prosecution called 3 more witnesses. Ruth, Leah, and Dina, each testifying about the fear that governed daily life on the estate, about the way Elijah used food as control, about Rebecca's slow decline. The defense countered with testimony from the auctioneer who had sold the women, from neighbors who reported no signs of abuse, and from a physician who stated that fever was a common cause of death among enslaved people, and that starvation was difficult to prove without a physical examination of the body. On the 7th day of trial, Elijah himself took the stand. He was composed, almost serene as Rutherford led him through his testimony. He described the fire that had killed his family, the 15 years he had spent researching what had happened, his decision to purchase the 7 women because of their connections to that night. I wanted to understand, Elijah said, his voice calm. I needed to know why my wife and daughters died. The official investigation had closed within weeks. The families involved had covered up their connections, and no one would tell me the truth. So I found the descendants of those who were involved and I asked them questions. Some cooperated willingly like Hannah, others like Rebecca refused. I disciplined those who refused as was my legal right. Did you intend to kill Rebecca? Rutherford asked. No, I intended to persuade her to cooperate. When she became ill, I provided what medical care I could, but she was weak from refusing to eat properly, and the fever took her quickly. Do you regret her death? Elijah was silent for a moment. Then he said, I regret that she felt the need to resist so strongly. I regret that she died before I could learn what her grandmother knew about that night, but I don't regret trying to find the truth about what happened to my family. The prosecutor, Ashton, stood for cross-examination. Mr. Thornhill, you've described your actions as seeking truth. But isn't it more accurate to say you were seeking revenge? Revenge against whom? The people who set the fire escaped north 17 years ago. I'll never see them brought to justice. The families who covered up their involvement are protected by wealth and social position. What revenge could I possibly take that would matter? Revenge against the descendants of those who escaped. Revenge enacted through psychological torture and starvation. I broke no laws, Mr. Ashton. Everything I did was within my rights as a property owner. That doesn't make it moral. No. Elijah agreed quietly. It doesn't. But we're not here to discuss morality. We're here to discuss legality. And legally I've done nothing wrong. It was a devastatingly honest answer, one that cut to the heart of the case's fundamental problem. Elijah had operated within the law, using the legal structures of slavery to enact a personal obsession that had resulted in at least one death. But if those structures protected his actions, how could he be convicted? The trial lasted 11 days total. In his closing argument, Ashton painted Elijah as a man consumed by grief, who had twisted the law to serve his obsession, who had used human beings as tools in his quest for information, who had created a system of torture that was legal only because the law itself was unjust. Rutherford's closing focused on property rights, on the precedent that would be set if a man could be convicted for disciplining his own property, on the dangerous implications of allowing enslaved people's testimony to override a white man's legal rights. Judge Carmichael took 2 days to deliberate. On November 15, 1853, he returned to the courtroom and delivered his verdict. This court finds itself in an impossible position, Carmichael began. We are asked to rule on actions that are morally reprehensible but legally protected. Mr. Thornhill has admitted to systematically withholding food from Rebecca as punishment for disobedience. He has admitted that her death resulted, at least in part, from the weakness brought on by this punishment. Under any reasonable moral standard, these actions constitute abuse and possibly murder. However, this court is not governed by moral standards. We are governed by law. And under the laws of the state of Alabama and the United States, enslaved people are property. Property owners have the right to discipline their property as they see fit within extremely broad boundaries. Those boundaries are rarely enforced and difficult to define. The prosecution has argued that Mr. Thornhill's actions crossed those boundaries. That deliberate starvation resulting in death constitutes destruction of property that violates interstate commerce laws. This is a creative legal argument, but it is not supported by sufficient precedent. Therefore, this court finds Elijah Thornhill not guilty of the charges brought against him. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered, others shouted in protest. Judge Carmichael gave for order, but the damage was done. Elijah Thornhill walked out of the courthouse a free man. Calloway stood outside in the cold November air, watching Elijah climb into a carriage that would return him to Montgomery. Hannah stood beside the carriage, waiting. She looked back once at Calloway, and in that glance, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not despair, but a strange, quiet resolve. 3 weeks after the trial, Calloway received a telegram at his office in Mobile. It was brief. Come to Montgomery immediately. Thornhill Estate. Something you need to see. Marshall Gaines. He arrived the next afternoon to find the estate surrounded by local authorities. Marshall Gaines met him at the gate, his face pale and drawn. Inspector, I owe you an apology. You were right about everything. What happened? Elijah Thornhill is dead. And what we found in his house. You need to see it yourself. The study on the second floor had been transformed. The walls were covered with papers, hundreds of them, documenting not just Elijah's 15-year research, but something far more elaborate. Maps showed the current locations of every person connected to the families involved in the 1836 escape. Lists detailed their ages, occupations, family connections. But more disturbing were the documents dated after the trial. Calloway found Hannah in the parlor sitting calmly with her hands folded. What happened here, Hannah? He came back from the trial changed, she said quietly. Triumphant, but also lost. He had proven his point that the law protected him, but it didn't give him what he really wanted. It didn't bring his family back. It didn't make the guilt go away. How did he die? He stopped eating. Just like he did to Rebecca, he did to himself. Refused every meal we prepared. Sat in his study for 11 days, growing weaker until his heart simply stopped. I found him 4 days ago. Calloway looked at her carefully. You could have gotten help. Called a doctor. I could have, Hannah agreed. But he made his choice. And I honored it just as he honored Rebecca's choice in his own terrible way. There's more, isn't there? Something you haven't told me. Hannah stood and walked to a drawer in the side table. She pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to Calloway. He asked me to give this to you after he was gone. He said, you were the only person who would understand. Inside was a letter in Elijah's handwriting dated November 18, 1853. Inspector Calloway, if you are reading this, I am dead by my own hand, or rather by my own refusal to sustain myself. The trial proved what I always knew, that I operated within the law, even as I violated every moral principle. But it also proved something else. It proved that the law itself is the crime. For 17 years, I blamed the people who set the fire that killed my family. I spent 15 years tracking their descendants, bringing 7 women to my property to interrogate them, to force them to reveal family secrets. I convinced myself I was seeking justice, seeking truth. But the trial made me see clearly what I had become. I had used the law's protection of slavery to enact personal revenge. I had turned human beings into instruments of my obsession. I had become the very thing I hated. Someone who destroyed families, who took away freedom, who used power to inflict suffering. Rebecca died because I was too blind to see that her resistance was more honorable than my quest. She chose death rather than betray her grandmother's memory. That choice had more integrity than anything I have done in 17 years. I am ending my life as a form of penance, but also as a final statement. If the law protects men like me, if it allows us to commit atrocities under the guise of property rights, then the law must be changed. Let my death be evidence of how thoroughly slavery corrupts both slave and master. Hannah and the other women are freed in my will. The property goes to them jointly. It is inadequate compensation for what I have done. But it is all I can offer. Tell the world what happened here, Inspector. Not just that a man starved his slave and was acquitted, but that the law made him believe he had the right to do so. Tell them that slavery destroys everyone it touches and that legal rights built on human suffering will eventually destroy the society that protects them. Elijah Thornhill Calloway folded the letter carefully. Did you know he was planning this? I suspected, Hannah said. After the trial he seemed defeated despite his victory. He had proven he could operate within the law, but it gave him no peace. I think he finally understood that what he had been seeking all these years wasn't truth or justice. It was redemption. And that was something the law could never give him. What will you do now? Hannah looked around the parlor at the house that had been a prison for nearly 2 years. We'll sell the property. The 7 of us will divide the money and go our separate ways. Some will head north. Some will stay in Alabama. I haven't decided yet. But we'll be free. Truly free for the first time in our lives. The trial changed nothing legally. Calloway said, men will continue to abuse their power. The law will continue to protect them. The trial changed everything. Hannah corrected gently. It forced people to see what slavery actually is. Not some benevolent institution, not property rights, but legalized torture. Elijah's death, his confession, it all becomes part of the record now. Part of the evidence that will eventually bring this system down. She was right. Calloway realized the trial transcripts, Elijah's journals, the letters from Rebecca and Hannah, all of it would survive. Future generations would read about the Thornhill case and see clearly what the law had protected and what it had destroyed. The story spread through Alabama and beyond. Newspapers in the North published excerpts from the trial transcripts from Elijah's final letter. Abolitionist speakers cited the case as evidence of slavery's moral bankruptcy. Southern defenders of slavery dismissed it as an isolated incident, but the details were too disturbing to ignore completely. Hannah and the 6 other women sold the Thornhill estate in January 1854. They divided the proceeds equally and went their separate ways, most heading north to free states. Hannah herself settled in Philadelphia, where she lived quietly until her death in 1889. She never spoke publicly about her time on the Thornhill estate, but she kept copies of all the documents, all the letters, everything that testified to what had happened there. Inspector Thomas Calloway continued his work investigating illegal slave trading operations until the Civil War began in 1861. He joined the Union Army and survived the war, later working for the Freedmen's Bureau, helping formerly enslaved people navigate their new freedom. He died in 1891, and among his papers was a complete file on the Thornhill case, carefully preserved. The Thornhill estate stood empty for 3 years after the sale, then burned to the ground in a fire of unknown origin in 1857. Some locals claimed they saw lights moving through the abandoned building in the weeks before it burned. Others insisted it was divine judgment on a cursed place. The property was never rebuilt. Today, a state historical marker stands near where the house once was, commemorating the Thornhill incident of 1853 as a pivotal moment in the legal and moral debates over slavery that would eventually tear the nation apart. But the real legacy of what happened there lives in the documents, in the testimony of the women who survived, and in the disturbing questions it raises about legal systems built on human suffering. Elijah Thornhill operated within the law. That was the horror, and that was the lesson that could not be ignored. What do you think about this story? Could something like this really have happened in America's past? The legal records exist. The testimonies were documented, but the moral questions remain unanswered even today. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think, made you uncomfortable, made you question how legal and moral can be so far apart, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten histories that deserve to be remembered. Hit that notification bell and join us in exploring the darkest corners of America's past. Because only by understanding what happened can we ensure it never happens again.